He appeared composed at first. This is merely another conversation with a different visitor. When Perry Stone leaned in and lowered his voice, everything changed. Because his remarks on Joni Lamb were unplanned and unsoftened, people were surprised to hear them on live television. The host froze, and the air became motionless, preventing anyone from breathing for a moment. You may believe you are an expert on Daystar, but you are not. Because the whole thing was blown apart by this news. Joni Lamb was inaccessible for many years. She represented religion, family, and quiet strength, and was more than just a Christian TV face. Together with her late husband, Marcus Lamb, she helped create Daystar from the ground up. Together, they turned it. It has developed into one of the most powerful Christian networks in the world. Joni was the voice that millions of people could rely on, pray to, and cry to. But as soon as Perry Stone's voice could be heard, everything changed. It caught everyone off guard. Perry didn't criticize or draw attention to himself. He had spent many years as a Christian with the same folks. On Daystar, he gave sermons. That because he knew the Lambs, his comments had even greater impact. He didn't come out with vague concerns or subdued inquiries. It was courageous. It felt like lightning and was really loud. According to Perry, Joni Lamb was doing more than simply continuing Marcus's work. She was penning it once more. She was in charge of Daystar behind the scenes, he said. She wasn't only in charge of the plan, he said. She selected the worship, the speakers, the subjects, and the message that was shown on television. According to him, Joni viewed everything through her own prism in order to support her own opinions, voice, and, most startling of all, plan. People became chilly. At first, they didn't want to believe it. She publicly lamented her husband, talked about her faith as if it were her lifeblood, and prayed on television. Joni Lamb was her name. Perry did not stop there. It wasn't just about power, he claimed. It was about money, too. Joni allegedly used money to decide who received assistance, who was left behind, and who received airtime. As he spoke, I was unable to ignore him any longer. Churches started humming. Ministry groups that had collaborated with Daystar began to inquire. Longtime viewers continued to watch the show, wondering, had they missed something? Was there always something off? Forums and social media erupted, but Joni remained silent. That silence was devoid of tranquility. People were left wondering, why not simply state that Perry's claims were untrue? Why not retaliate? Instead, Joni remained silent. She continued to appear on TV as if nothing had changed. However, everything had. It was a broken relationship. And when the crack appeared, it expanded swiftly. Some immediately defended her. People believed Perry was causing turmoil in the body of Christ, was jealous and harbored resentment towards someone. However, other people were unsure. This turned out to be more than just another online article. The public charge was made by someone with close connections to the ministerial realm. Everything happened in a flash. The ministries started to retreat. Invitations to speak were declined by guest speakers. The practice of clicking on Daystar movies and sharing them has been discontinued. Donors began to demand transparency. Staff insiders started telling tales. The fissures widened and became fractures. It quickly became evident that this would not resolve itself. The speech of one individual became considerably more than anyone had anticipated. Joni Lamb was no longer the only focus. It was about trust, leadership, and the backroom operations. The Christian world was rocked. For the first time in decades, the word Daystar did not improve her mood. It caused many to reflect. Nobody, not even Joni, was able to reassemble the parts in the same manner. Daystar appeared to be all that it claimed to be, a community of Christians who are united by truth, faith, and hope. The settings were luminous. They smiled at the hosts. The music continued to rise. It appeared tidy, effective, and serene. However, a separate world was developing behind the scenes that few anyone ever saw. And in the center of that invisible realm stood Joni Lamb. After Marcus Lamb passed away, many assumed Joni would take a back seat or serve only as a symbol while others took over. She had always been viewed as the calm, supporting spouse, the loyal wife who assisted her husband in his job. We believed that to be untrue, since it became evident over time that Joni had covertly seized all of Daystar's values, including the business and all of its choices and orientation. It started out slowly. Changes became apparent to those present. Previously, frequent preachers were no longer being called back. Some sermons that challenged leadership, overemphasized humility, or attempted to expose power systems were subtly removed from the timetable. Programs that gave individuals a sense of security, unity, and control took their place. It didn't happen by accident. They were the focus. Joni started to alter the material so that it was more in line with her vision for Daystar rather than the message. She was unconcerned about it. It was the reason it worked so brilliantly. There was no takeover. During the transition, there was no noise. There was silent authority behind closed doors, no public declarations, no letters. According to a number of former pastors and employees, Joni only paid attention to a select few people she trusted. If you were in, you remained. If you ever ventured to question her, you were forced out. It was simply removed, with no drama or argument. According to one speaker, he was placed on hold as they made other plans, and they never gave him a call again. Another claimed that he was tactfully advised to avoid situations that caused discomfort for superiors. The number of speakers who ceased speaking increased over time. The only people left were those who abided by the unspoken norms. Don't talk too much. Keep Joni pleased and don't do anything wrong. And there was the money. There was more to Daystar than just watching advertisements. It had enormous financial power. Each year, donors contributed a significant amount of money. In good faith, many who supported the cause donated money. However, some with knowledge of the plan said that the funding also gave Joni a great deal of influence. She was in charge of who talked, who received assistance, and who didn't. All with a single pen stroke. Ministries that shared her views were commended and encouraged. Those that didn't moved aside politely. Some of her employees even claimed that she switched groups from Daystar to another by using donations and easy access to funds. According to reports, she negotiated behind the scenes with benevolent pastors to offer them cash as a token of appreciation. These agreements kept her detractors at bay and her supporters devoted. Although none of it appeared to be unlawful, it demonstrated that money was being used for power as well as services. Joni's acquaintances were also crucial. Among her friends were prominent pastors, business executives, and politicians. These weren't your average pals. The relationships in question had lasted for decades. You ought to be aware of when to talk and when to be quiet. She also knew who to turn to in times of need. That network prevented inquiries and gave the impression that Joni was impervious to damage. But it wasn't all silence. Over the years, a few courageous individuals have begun to speak forward, some behind the scenes, some in public view. The concepts of their stories were similar, even though they differed on the details. Joni was the leader. She would not tolerate arguments. Furthermore, Daystar wasn't as forthright or honest as it appeared. What was frightening about it all was how expertly it had been concealed. Power was gradually and systematically seized. There was no shouting or debate. The radio communications that were disseminated were examined. The visitors were selected. Others claimed that the praise music was deliberately chosen to maintain order rather than to elicit excitement. Joni, too. She remained steady, composed, and unmoved. She hardly ever discussed the more significant topics as the network expanded. She didn't dispute the whispers, even as they grew louder. She didn't confirm them either. She simply continued to lecture about grace and trust while grinning. Everything behind the curtain was tightly controlled. According to former workers, it was a stressful workplace. Not many people expressed a desire to walk on it. You may be fired for one mistake, one slurred word, or one incorrect glance. It was more than just their performance. It was about telling Joni the truth in particular. In terms of details, Perry Stone's public statements helped a lot of viewers and donors see the wider picture. His comments pierced the glossy exterior. Suddenly, the faint murmurs and small warning signs were quite evident. People started rewatching previous episodes with new perspectives. They observed that everything felt secure and well-planned, and that some sounds were frequently absent. They had one inquiry as a result of this. Was it still a ministry, or had it evolved into something else? Joni remained silent during all of this, which exacerbated the situation. Supporters claimed that by not retaliating against the rumors, she was being polite. Some claimed she was trying to hide and avoid the truth. Either way, she remained calm and silent. It was just business, as normal, as if it didn't matter, with no interviews or debates. But it did matter. It mattered to the workers who watched their employment become a machine instead of a mission, the observers who felt deceived, and the pastors who were silenced. Additionally, it was significant to those who had donated funds, prayers, and hope to Daystar. There was more than simply rhetoric behind the curtain. It was true, one that many people are just now beginning to comprehend completely. For years, Daystar had been built on money, power, and quiet dominance. Joni Lamb, the calm woman in the center, wasn't merely following the crowd. She was in the vehicle. Nobody noticed the impending tempest when Perry Stone revealed the huge news about Joni Lamb. Daystar's studio and the typical online chat forums were not the only places where the rumors circulated. It swept through entire faith communities, churches, and homes like wildfire. What began as a scandal soon became a spiritual tremor. A woman at the center of it all was more valuable for her quiet than any sermon. In Christian society, there are many problems. We have all witnessed groups disintegrate, leaders lose their positions, and positive reputations get tarnished. However, it wasn't the case here. Joni Lamb was not merely a supervisor. She served as a sign. For decades, she had been accepted as a kind face of religion in living rooms. People prayed and wept with her because they believed she was a kind person. The deception felt so familiar because of this. People felt everything as soon as Perry Stone's words were broadcast. Individuals didn't simply react, they disintegrated. "Did you hear what he said?" was a common question in small Bible studies, and Christian boards and Facebook groups were flooded with posts. Some couldn't believe it while others opposed Joni. Suddenly, as arguments erupted in the pews and prayer groups, pastors nationwide had to attempt to hold their congregations together. Seeing it crushed my heart. Previously united in prayer, groups were now divided by uncertainty. Some folks didn't think it was true at all. "Not Joni," they defended. She claimed, "She's always been loyal and stood for the truth." As the power increased and the programming altered, several individuals noticed the silence and started to question whether the whispers were just the start of something larger. The situation caused more than simply disagreements. Open wounds were broken by it. Those who donated to Daystar felt defrauded. They believed they were funding a ministry rather than a scam. Formerly proud to advocate for the network, volunteers now felt ashamed and self-conscious. In online confessionals, some people shared their suffering, stating that it was difficult to love the church, yet feel deceived. Joni's silence just made matters worse. She remained silent. She didn't clarify anything on radio or television. For her, nothing appeared to have changed. Whether the decision was made on the basis of stubborn pride, legal guidance, or religious faith, it hurt a lot. Not answering at all was the solution for many. It gave the inquiries a more authentic feel. The betrayal wounded much more. Then came the preaching. Everyone in the church was aware of the significant issue that needed to be resolved. Some pastors were cautious and assured their congregations that Christianity is still based on grace and that no one is perfect. Some even went so far as to warn of the dangers of unbridled power and platforms that become too large to be challenged. People cautioned against the church being overly similar to Hollywood, where organizations begin to resemble large corporations. But the harm was already done, regardless of what they did. A lot of individuals were upset, but they were lost beyond all else. Daystar had been their spiritual lifeline for many years. They could find strength when they were down, insight when they were perplexed, and hope when they were ill. There. Now they doubted if any of it was accurate. That uncertainty permeated every aspect. Did the worship actually happen? Were the prayers truly said? Did someone with a design say those things, or did God say them? Such a way of thinking not only causes individuals to lose faith in networks, but in everything. For many, in fact, that is precisely what occurred. Some folks declared they would never watch Daystar again after permanently quitting. Others held on even more tightly, certain that this was merely spiritual warfare meant to ruin a decent woman. The majority of people, however, were ultimately caught in the middle, attempting to distinguish between what was real and what was only noise. People quit attending churches because they could no longer trust one another, not because they held different ideas. Longtime friends ceased communicating. Bible study groups disbanded. It was more difficult to pray when the person you once trusted the most felt like a stranger. Additionally, pastors were exhausted from the burden of watching. Their communities disintegrate over something they had no control over, in addition to the disagreements. Joni Lamb wasn't the only person who experienced a crisis of faith. It has to do with her values. She was supposed to be a voice of truth in a world full of turmoil and noise. That voice's accusations of deceit and manipulation were not limited to a leadership issue. They were the focus. People believed they had been duped spiritually, and it's difficult to get rid of that kind of suffering. Christian podcasters, YouTubers, and influencers took sides. In their support of Joni, their examination of Perry Stone's intentions, and their skepticism over his reliability, some people went even farther. Others investigated Daystar's history by discovering odd patterns, timelines, and films. All of the evidence, ideas, timings, and testimonials that were suddenly available online pointed in different directions. Joni's silence remained unchanged. Publicly, the ministry was not simply dismantled. The peace, harmony, and faith all collapsed. It was an open and deep spiritual wound that forced people to confront difficult issues. Some churches made an effort to assist people in recovering. What happens when a leader we trust goes astray? Can faith survive betrayal? And is there a way forward when the damage feels this great? They held prayer nights for those who had been harmed, not for Joni or Perry. They allow people to be alone, cry, or vent on their altars. They assured the populace that since God is greater than any scandal, religion can endure even in the face of failed leaders. Regaining that trust, however, will take time. For some people, it may not return. This was about more than that. It was time to reconcile, to remind us that when Christian platforms become too large, too polished, or too secure, they lose the very message they were intended to convey: authenticity. That information was far more upsetting to many Christians than anything Perry Stone could have said. At some point, Daystar, Joni Lamb, and those close to her might comment. They could apologize. They may refuse. They may even begin anew. However, Christians' lives have already been altered by this occurrence. This created a crisis of faith that will last for years to come, divided churches, and shattered the public. A few rumors concerning Joni Lamb soon became a full-fledged commotion. But later came the greater shock. As the days stretched into weeks, the rage persisted, and something even more significant began to occur. It was not only an issue. Perry Stone's words and one woman's actions weren't the only factors involved. It transformed into something else, In Christian media, it was the end of the world as we know it. Initially, Joni was the center of attention. It hurt a lot to be accused of controlling people's money, power, and religion. The cracks weren't only at her feet, though, as viewers, preachers, and others who knew her better looked closer. They passed directly past Daystar's base and entered space. Initially, what appeared to be a solitary disagreement was actually a symptom of a far more serious disease. Daystar had traditionally been one of the world's most influential Christian news outlets. The stream wasn't the only one. It was a kingdom. Massive donations, millions of viewers, and the opportunity to speak with religious leaders, celebrities, and legislators. However, the response was neither straightforward nor simple to accept when people lost faith in its leaders and wondered, how did it get this bad without anyone noticing? Conversations began. Christian singers, church leaders, and former employees of Daystar and other organizations shared their behind-the-scenes experiences. There were stories about backdoor deals, ministries that prioritized ratings over the truth, and platforms that were supposed to preach the gospel but actually served the interests of the wealthy. As was common in the business world, it was evident that Daystar was not the only location where electricity was not being checked. As Christian networks began to function more like companies, driven by profit, power, and control over others, something significant was lost. The whole thing started because of that disagreement with Joni Lamb. For years, ministries operated with little to no transparency. Most people never learned what happened to the money they donated, even though they thought it would support programs or missions. Celebrity preachers received accolades on television, but behind closed doors, there were reports of extravagant spending, huge salaries, and ego-driven leadership. Everyone was furious when the curtain was pulled back to reveal the truth. Daystar was once shown on large screens during church services, but it was abruptly discontinued. Congregations made the decision to cease financial contributions. Publicly, pastors expressed regret for ever having backed the network. Bible study groups had shifted their focus from the message to the ease with which it had been marketed, packaged, and manipulated on television. Then, one by one, more names started to appear. Other media Christians who had previously shunned scrutiny suddenly discovered that they were being attentively examined. Accusations began to surface, some pertaining to excessive pride, others to money, and yet others to morals. People ceased to assume the best of others. They demanded documentation, evidence, and straightforward responses. Blind faith was no longer present. On a spiritual level, it worsened. Those who had discovered Christ as a result of these programs began to doubt everything. Were they truly convinced? Were they misled? Did God truly speak through these individuals? Or did they simply watch the shows while sitting there? For many, it led to an issue with their spiritual identity. They felt confused, indignant, and even duped by a system that claimed to speak for God. The length of time that had been going on was the most agonizing aspect. You were warned by signs. Messages are becoming too polished, businesses are becoming too wealthy, and leaders are becoming too powerful. But nobody raised their voice. They were silenced, pushed away, or made to appear cruel and disloyal if they did. Those voices had been silenced, and people were now listening. Not simply people outside of Daystar saw the fall. It was within. Employees began to leave. Leaders' conversations turned heated. Formerly silent long-term employees now doubt everything. Rumors circulated about investigations, audits, and legal action. Managing pictures was no longer the focus. Getting through was the goal. Furthermore, Joni's chances of surviving appeared to decrease the longer she remained silent. However, Daystar was struggling, and the crash worsened. Sponsors began to leave networks like this. Ministries hurried to reassert their honesty and integrity regarding money in public remarks. To ensure they wouldn't be connected to the expanding scam, some even engaged outside auditors. With a great deal of hope, damage control was carried out swiftly and loudly. There was a judgment in the midst of everything, not only for networks or leaders, but also for viewers. People started to reflect carefully on who they followed, who they trusted, and why. They acknowledged that perhaps they had been too eager to worship people rather than the truth, too inclined to believe, and too content with what was simple when they looked in the mirror.